Ladies, gentlemen, and ethereal beings from beyond the spirit realm, welcome to the human energy field. As always, I'm your host, Henry, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Jamie. How are you doing tonight, Jamie? You alright, mate?
Doing very well, thank you, Henry. Very pleased to be here again, talking about two of my favourite subjects.
Yeah, well, you're going to be doing a lot of talking for this episode. We want to focus on the occult in role-playing games, at least for the first hour or so of discussion, and how these things are intertwined and how they relate to each other. We're going to move on later on to our film segment and our music segment as usual. So look forward to those. I'm getting a lot better with these cold opens, I'll be honest. I'm feeling more comfortable opening cold and going straight in. I'm doing a lot better at them.
No, it sounds all good. Sounds good. Don't let me stop your flow.
And we've got some more technical improvements as well. I've upgraded my microphone, and hopefully the quality is going to improve noticeably episode on episode. So guys, keep an ear out for that. We'll upgrade the software and stuff as well as we go along. So we're hoping to just have a more professional experience and a more rounded experience as we release these and as we get the hang of what we're doing as we get off the ground. So first of all, I mean, I'm gonna let you take the reins a bit for this episode because this is something I'll defer to you on. So what made you decide this is something that we can get an hour's worth of discussion out of, and what would be the main kind of jumping off point for something like this, do you think?
I think the main reason that this is such a hot potato for a role playing style discussion is even casual role players and role players as well will have heard of buzzwords like the Satanic Panic, and they'll be aware that a lot of role-playing games have in them spells, magicians, and spellcasters. I mean, by its very nature, role-playing game is intertwined with that kind of activity, spellcasting, summoning, and all that kind of stuff, from its very genesis, which is D&D. So I think we can look at it from a few different points of view. We can look at it historically as the presentation of the occult has developed in the RPG industry over time, and we can also look about snapshots of maybe how it's affected the industry outside of the gaming table, with regards to the aforementioned Satanic Panic and various other religious groups and opinions, especially near the beginning of role-playing game, in the late 70s and early 80s. That was much more of a thing, whereas we don't really worry about that right now. But so I think there's plenty of things to be able to throw out onto the table.
Cool. Well, let's start there then, shall we? Let's start with the Satanic Panic. Do you want to tell me a little bit about where that came from, who was the sort of genesis of it, and why it came into existence? What was the Satanic Panic?
Okay, so I'm going to preface this with the knowledge that I'm not an American, so I didn't really experience this, and I'm not old enough to experience this firsthand. So I think you would get a lot more precise information from somebody who was around at the time and somebody who was in the same geographic location. Having that being said, I have read a lot about it in magazines and books and various articles. So the Satanic Panic was essentially the extreme Christian response to the Dungeons and Dragons game in America. What you had a whole bunch of kids who, for the very first time, were engaged in a hobby that was mentioning things like demons and devils and summoning and magic users and clerics and all of these weird buzzwords that had not really been bandied around kind of kids' leisure time before, and especially in certain parts of America, and especially at that time, as I've mentioned, we're talking about the mid to late 70s at the beginning of this. There were a lot more people who were more straight-laced and were a lot more worried about this. People who aren't really immersed in this kind of role-playing kind of history and industry will be able to get a little insight into this, because I think it's very similar to the way that a lot of metal bands were treated in America. And there are some famous court cases and things like that. So I mean, anyone who's familiar with the effect that metal music has had on the populace and fear around all of that kind of thing, that is to an element. Now, obviously, Dungeons and Dragons, was quite popular back then, but it never really reached the heights that were made by the the metal bands and those kind of rockers at that time. So it's a much smaller thing, but it did have huge impact on the RPG industry.
So you've got this sort of Christian right who are reacting. It was a reactionary response more than anything else, wasn't it? Just to, without really educating themselves on the details of what was going on, they just took it at face value and decided it was against their beliefs, more or less.
Absolutely, and I mean you've got to bear in mind that, I mean, these reactions were had to, as I've said, music, literature, hobbies, state of dress. This extreme conservative viewpoint will have been easy to demonize everything. And I think Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, it even sounds, if you hadn't heard that title before, it sounds a bit odd, it sounds a bit dark. So no wonder that it was easy prey for these, for these panic mongers to go through the press, and especially through the churches. And there were some high profile cases of individuals who had either hurt themselves or caused harm to other people by connecting themselves to this hobby. Now, obviously, these were fringe individuals. Nobody really connected to any of the major companies or game designers. And you're always going to get people who will abuse a medium or a hobby because they're just a little unstable or have their own issues. And they made huge, big kind of prime cases, which only helped to fuel this satanic panic in America in the late 70s and early 80s. So much so that even literature was distributed in order to warn parents against the prospective demonization of their children by role-playing groups and dungeon masters who would tell them that if their cleric reached level 9, then all of a sudden they would have the power to kind of put curses on their parents and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's a mixture of the fact that the hobby was very new and the fact that there were people out there who were willing to literally demonize anything. But what's really interesting from an RPG historian's point of view was the effect that this Satanic Panic had on Dungeons and Dragons, and then some of the earlier releases. So what we have is Dungeons and Dragons in its original incarnation was a lot more heavy-handed with devils and demons, and then they made a slight shift as they progressed into the kind of later editions to almost cut out that almost biblical demons and devils and angels. They renamed a lot of it, they shifted it, they did more work in creating the outer planes, which just created 9 levels of not quite hell, but there was hell, and there was kind of light realms, dark realms, and they kind of shifted themselves away from this black and white, so to speak, and made it a little bit more fantastical.
So tie this down for me a little bit, if you wouldn't mind. Are we talking 2nd edition, AD&D? We talk coming into 3rd edition? When?
No,
sort of time period?
Long before that. So we're talking about drifting from kind of early in 1st edition into 2nd edition. A lot of it was dropped.
Right. Okay. Because before then, there was. I guess it wasn't famous enough to have received any of these reactions, so they were just going along with what they were doing. Right?
I think when they first created the game, they were happy to put in demons and devils, and magic users could summon, various archdemons of hell and all this kind of thing. And even though that did continue to exist, that did continue to exist throughout the game, it was certainly pushed onto a back foot as the game became much more popular, and the print runs were becoming much higher and everything, just as a kind of self-protection mode, I think. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't removed entirely. You still had monster summoning, you still had these dark realms and everything, but it was shifted slightly away from what people would instantly recognize as potentially satanic into what could be argued was the realm of fantasy. So I think they kind of did that as a response. But it didn't take long for the RPG industry to have a backlash against that, and for games in the 80s to come out that really dealt with, I'll use the supernatural as a catch-all umbrella, because it's not all just about Satan worship and all that kind of devils and demons, but the supernatural element of ghosts and psychics and all that kind of stuff, which was kind of wrapped up in that. There was a lot more games came out when the industry had kind of been around a lot longer and had matured and developed, and even those games came in for a lot of stick in the early days. Palladium Books came out with quite a dark game called Beyond the Supernatural, which was kind of a Call of Cthulhu-esque investigatory game, but it was wrapped up in a lot of very dark imagery and, quite nasty monsters. It wasn't these fantastical beasts that had come out of the Monsters Manual. These were more akin to the kind of things you would see in a, Hellblazer comic and, that kind of, these dark kind of horror comics. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
What's that like to play? Beyond the Supernatural is called. Is it any good? Is it worth
I
playing?
really like it. Without going on a huge tangent, it's one of Palladium Games' books. So it uses their house system, which is used for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Rifts and the Palladium Fantasy game and Recon and all of these other games, Ninjas and Super Spies. So the system is basically like a D&D clone. But it's fairly good. It's quite a good early dark forerunner to games that would come out like Dark Conspiracy and things like that. But I mean, the granddaddy of the horror role playing games obviously was Call of Cthulhu. So I think that had a lot of effect on Beyond the Supernatural and things like that.
And Call of Cthulhu first edition came out when?
Put me on the spot here, but it was very early. I'm going to say early 80s. It was, in my mind, I always have Dungeons and Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, and Traveller as the three pillars of early role playing. So I mean, Chaosium were releasing Call of Cthulhu quite early. I'm going to go out there and say about 82, 83. I could Google it, of course, and there'll be people who can Google it. But I would say mid 80s, so around then, I think.
So Chaosium have been dabbling in the occult role-playing game kind of world for a while now, because they've got quite a few books that have come out in that sort of vein, haven't they? They've done a few things like Nephilim and other games to that degree.
Yeah, I wondered how long it would take for us to get around to Nephilim, and that was a game published by Chaosium, and I think that to me is the first role-playing game that came out that was based on what I would call real occult knowledge rather than kind of very fantastical side of magic. Because what you've got to remember is, I've mentioned this before, but the magic system in Dungeons and Dragons was essentially lifted from the fantasy literature of Jack Vance, the way that magicians memorize their spells and cast them, and even the names of some spells. And it's not until we get to games like Call of Cthulhu and then eventually games like Nephilim, where you've got men and or women, drawing circles and using, books of ancient lore and sacrifices and things that have more relation to, the Golden Bough than they do with Jack Vance. So you get into a real magical element. But I think it's worth saying that I think Call of Cthulhu always got off a little bit more lightly because it was so entrenched in what was absolute fiction. It was H.P. Lovecraft's fiction. And even though H.P. Lovecraft himself was probably very well versed in the magical beliefs of various ancient cultures and subcultures, of course he was, and that drifted into his writing, and then that drifted into the game. Spellcasting in Call of Cthulhu and magic itself was always really the domain of the NPC or the bad guys. It may have changed over the time, and I think it's become much more common for investigators in Call of Cthulhu to cast spells. But at the beginning, learning and casting spells was a real detriment to your sanity, so it wasn't something you could do very much of without going insane, which I guess is the final result of any Call of Cthulhu investigator if he doesn't die first.
It's really the classic game, isn't it, that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a horror game, but it doesn't fall into this occult level of role-playing that I think some later games did. And to go back to Nephilim, I think, I've forgotten the guy who it was written alongside somebody who was really well versed in these, hermetic, theosophical ideas, and it mentioned a lot of these real world beliefs that were then mixed in with the game in order to create like this tapestry of fantasy and reality that mixed together. And I think that was a really brave thing to do. But by that point, a lot of that panic had died down. So you get a lot more role playing games now that will draw on real religious and occult practices as the basis for their magic systems.
Specifically in regards to Hermeticism, if I wanted to roleplay something that involved Hermetic practices or esotericism, where would I begin with that?
I mean, I think the first one that comes to mind would be White Wolf's original Mage the Ascension role-playing game. The very society that those mages are from is the Order of Hermes, so it goes back to that original, that Hermetic idea. Obviously, the game is wide enough to have practitioners of various other magic systems, whether it be the Dream Speakers, who are kind of First Nations, kind of more shamanistic practices, or the Euthanatos, which is kind of more ancient Hindi, and all sorts of various things that are wrapped up in that. Cult of ecstasy, like drug magic and all that kind of stuff. But the core element to that, which came out of Ars Magica, because Mage the Ascension is essentially just a modern version of the game Ars Magica, which was the Lion Rampart White Wolf game by Mark Reinhagen and Jonathan Tweet, which was actually part of the reason Mark Reinhagen actually got together with the guys at White Wolf to create Vampire the Masquerade, was because of the success of his medieval magic game, Ars Magica, which really goes deep into genuine medieval alchemistic kind of beliefs. So it took those whole ideas that were believed at the time, that whole kind of John Dee-esque ideas, and put that into the magic system. So that as we drag that forward into the modern day, we get a lot more kind of Golden Dawn, Order of the various other things. By the time we get the Mage Ascension, so we get that real hermetic viewpoint from the Order of Hermes in Mage the Ascension. I think would be the first one that would come to mind.
Going back to sort of 15th century Italy, when the things like the Lesser Key of Solomon were being written and kind of coming into prominence during that kind of occult renaissance in that period, and then moving forward from there, was really when people had this idea about listing these princes and kings and dukes and this kind of thing, and having the idea of you can summon their powers and harness them for your own gain, and this monetary gain or lust or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, without getting too historical into it, those concepts and those ideas go way back, especially in kind of very early kind of Judaism and proto-Christianity, and a lot of these things that were around at the same time as these Gnostic ideas that come into it. So, but yeah, I think what we would class as demonology per se, definitely was more of a later development, and that's when you get to these kind of 16th century and 17th century alchemists and occultists, and people that were starting to worship angels and demons and all this kind of stuff. So, which has now found its way. It's very common now, I think, in role-playing games. I mean, you only need to look at some of the core classes for D&D that exist at the minute. I mean, you have Warlocks. I mean, the very idea of a Warlock is, somebody who's made a dark pact with a being. So, I mean, to have that as one of the core classes in D&D now just shows how far we've come, that isn't shied away from, and that's not worried about, because the Warlock is a far distant character class from the magic user in terms of tone. So, as I say, we go from that Vancine idea all the way through to this Faustian idea by the time we get to the Warlock.
Yeah, I like that. It's almost become, what's the word I'm looking for? Like,
I think it's become diluted, because I think
that's it. Diluted.
Yeah,
that's
because I think people are the internet has done a lot of things to make people a lot more aware about different, religious and magical practices, and we have a lot more open communication with people who are practicing, Wiccans or pagans, or that isn't looked down upon or sideways upon like it may have used to have been a few decades ago. We have people who are overtly into and live their lives by these practices. So I think to expect that not to feed into a leisure time hobby would be naive. So obviously not only do we get people with these beliefs writing these games, but we get a lot of these people with these beliefs kind of playing these games, and board games, and video games also as well, but especially role-playing games, which have always had that element of the supernatural and magic using around them.
Yeah, and alchemy and stuff like that as well. And just, I think even the mere act of sitting at a table with a group of people and collectively telling a story is a form of summoning. in a way, isn't it? Really, it's a spellcasting in itself. Is you're bringing a story into being between your imaginations.
Well, I mean, when we really get into it, the act of speaking to each other, of forming the words, is spellcasting, because that's why we have the word to spell something. Because as we speak, we are literally casting spells. That's why we have the universe. It's the single song. But so the very act of getting everybody around a table, you're right. I mean, it is a ritual. It's a ritual of storytelling. We, whether consciously or subconsciously, are reenacting the great stories, the kind of tales of the gods and the demigods and the hero's journey and all of those kind of things that we, these archetypes. I think if you were to have a conversation with somebody like Carl Jung about the kind of hobby of role playing, I think you could really get into some interesting kind of dark corners about, what you're really doing and what it says about, the connected consciousness of the people around the table. And you start getting kind of bordering into creation of thought forms and things like that. So I mean, it's some interesting ideas.
I mean, there's almost too many ideas to get through in one episode, so we're definitely something we'll be coming back to in future episodes. And as always, I'll just take this quick opportunity to encourage listeners to join in the conversation in the future when we're able to open up this chat. If you have anything that you'd like to ask us about or chime in on, then do let us know. Get on the Instagram and get on the Discord when you can. So in terms of the mechanics of it, in terms of actually laying out game engines and systems and having dice in your hand, if I'm a crunchy kind of player, and if I'm someone who likes my rules and I like my systems to be laid out, would you say that's something that complements the idea of a hermetic or an occult role-playing game, or do you think those two ideas kind of clash with each other by their nature?
I think they clash with each other by their nature, if I'm honest, because anyone who is genuinely interested in magic, with a K, would realise that it isn't something that is done off the cuff. I mean, although we live magical lives, and everything that we do and say are essentially magical acts. So I'm not denying that to people who are into it from that idea. But I think in order to look at magical practices, it's often something that requires a lot of time, forethought, planning, down to the time of day, down to the resources that you have around you, what you prepare. So I think in order to accurately represent what I would call real magic in a role-playing game would be to take a lot of the fast pace and the drama out of the game, when really the role-playing games are essentially about having fun. So chucking a fireball down the street in a fantasy game is a lot more fun than developing a protection ritual, or summoning a dead teacher and, necromantically in order to kind of gain ideas from them. The ritual could take hours, if not, days. You don't want to deal with that in a regular session. You want your magic to be, click your fingers and it's done and move on. And I think that's where D&D managed to get that element almost right at the beginning, because magic just became another weapon, so to speak. And I think that's developed and altered through the editions of D&D, to the point now where we get actually the magic system in 5th edition. I'm going to call it complicated. Now, I know mechanically, with regards to some other systems, it's not complicated. But the reason I'm calling it complicated is just because of the sheer volume of different spells and the interaction of those spells with each other and with the game as a whole. All of those different combinations become, really complicated to think about, and can result in some interesting ways to deal with game mechanics. So I think that the D&D magic system has, although it was quite simple, has become quite complicated, in my opinion. I would say maybe too complicated.
It is kind of bloated a little bit.
I just think I've always had this issue with role-playing games where the D&D Player's Handbook, no matter which edition you go to, has always, in my opinion, suffered from the biggest flaw was how many of the pages were given over to spell descriptions. Now, I realise it's quite an important part of any role-playing game, but also, and this is not just D&D's fault. This is the fault of any game that has powers or spells or whatever. I mean, I was reading through a copy of Overlight this week by Renegade Game Studios, and I decided to read it cover to cover. You know, it's a new game. Well, it's not new to me. I decided to really get into it from the beginning and read it all the way through. Now, 100 of those pages, 80 or 100 of those pages out of a 300-page book are power descriptions, basically spells / superpowers. I haven't got time to read all of those. I want to get a rough idea of what the spells can do, but in terms of reading that book, I'm going to skip that entire 100-page section. So once I finish reading 200 pages, I'm done with that book. If I ever get around to playing it, which I hope I will, or running it, then I will pay much more attention to the minutiae inside of those descriptions. But especially as a D&D player, if you love to play a fighter or a thief or a cleric or whatever it happens to be, get into Dungeons and Dragons, and you know your dungeon master or the guy who you're going to play with, or the lady who's running the game, turns around and says, you know, pick yourself up a player's handbook, and that'll be great, and you'll have everything you need. If you were planning on playing a fighter, you can guarantee that a good chunk of that book is no use to you at all. Which is I've always kind of thought the magic rules should have been either in the DM's book or as a separate tome. So you could happily play D&D in a low magic world without that extra supplement, because it literally accounts for half, sometimes more than half, of the page count in the player's handbook with spells. It's quite ridiculous. By the time you go through all 9 levels of, you know, magic user spells and warlock spells and cleric spells and all that kind of stuff, it's just a huge page count.
And again, you're coming back to the idea of the rules getting in the way of the magical side of things, and instead of letting the magical idea flourish and grow,
I don't know. I think
it's almost holding you back.
I don't know about whether it holds you back, because actually, with so many spells, it allows for variation and allows magic users to be different to one another, and it allows you to come up with interesting combinations of spells and new spells and all that kind of stuff. So I don't have an issue with the choice that's offered, because I think when it comes down to power descriptions, whether it be spells or disciplines or superpowers, I think the more variety the better, because then there's a more variety of PCs and NPCs and various story interactions. My issue really, from a publisher's point of view, is that so much of that is given over to the game, whereas I think a lot of people, maybe not a lot of people, some people might want to run that game in a low magic setting, and a lot of that page count is then superfluous, absolutely. But to drag it back to talking about, you know, representation of kind of real magic in role-playing games, I think because a lot of magic takes a lot of time and is done personally and behind closed doors, and you know, may take a long time for the effects to become known, and it's not flashy, it doesn't suit itself to a dramatic storytelling hobby. Whereas you get this Vancian style magic again, which I keep talking about, which is much more suited to a role-playing style. And also, let's not forget that most superpowers in what you call a superheroic genre, it's essentially magic. And I know it's not. They can be created from all sorts of things, you know, alien technology or various mutant factors. But what we're talking about is magical abilities, essentially, by a different name. So, but it's much easier to get away with that in, you know, that kind of whole Marvel DC style idea, where that magic is a lot faster and a lot more innate. It doesn't really fall into that hermetic style of, you know, the guy with his crew, and, you know, spending 10 hours summoning a creature that might be able to, you know, give somebody a bad stomach, which is more like real magic, but that doesn't really lend itself very well to an exciting game of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, but I mean, we as games masters understand that everything has to be dramatized to a certain extent to create that story that we're all after. It's not just magic, is it? It's the same with everything else. Even conversations are shortened and made sharper and snappier for the purposes of the story. You know,
absolutely. You know, it's more cinematic that way. You know, and it's more dramatic and it's more entertaining. Which is why you aren't really going to get a lot of instances where the magical system in a role-playing game is able to mirror real magical systems to a major degree. So in that way, there's that safety net is there. So because you're not going to go into great detail, and some games do. Going back to Nephilim, there's some really, that's more about concepts than it is about anything else. But there are plenty of role playing games that you're doing demon summoning and drawing out of pentacles and all that kind of stuff and sacrifices, but they tend to be less common than the kind of magical systems where you just learn a spell and then can make yourself fly or cast a fireball or whatever, which isn't really ever really being considered real magic. I mean, I don't. You can get the gods and the demigods can do some amazing things, but I struggle with any kind of literature that tries to describe any magicians doing something so flashy. I mean, even some of the most famous, iconic mages. I mean, just look at Merlin. I mean, he wasn't throwing fireballs around. His gifts were in prophecy and herbalism and guidance and just being wise in general. He wasn't casting featherfall and magic missile. So I think we don't really get that kind of historical, pseudo historical / mythological representation of magic in role playing games. We get more of a comic book style high fantasy representation of magic, which suits the hobby, but that's the definition between what I would call real magical practices and otherwise.
Yeah, well, it suits the type of game, not necessarily the entire hobby, but yeah. I mean, the type of ritual spells are always the ones that have appealed to me more, and even when I'm flicking through the 5e handbook, all of the spells that have got the ritual tag in them are the ones that appeal to me the most. The idea that a spell doesn't just come out your fingertips, it actually requires some sort of effort and time and can go wrong before you gain that result. That is appealing to me. A spell as a process instead of a spell as a sort of instantaneous trigger.
I think there was some really interesting diversions, and to support Dungeons and Dragons at this point. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is you've just said, there's a lot of personal investment in a ritual, and it's part of that person committing themselves over to the end result. And I think I want to bring up the character of Raistlin, who was a major character in the Dragonlance Chronicles, especially the early ones. Obviously, he was one of the major heroes of the Lance. And I think what was really interesting with the way that they dealt with magic on the world of Kryn, which was the Dragonlance setting, was that using magic actually had a great toll on the individual casting it. It required a lot of basically channeling of that energy, and it took a great toll on the physical body. And nowhere was that more apparent than with the journey that the character of Raistlin went on. And I think that was a really interesting, and it was the first time I'd seen that in Dungeons and Dragons, where you get this almost magic has a cost, it has a human cost. And then I think they followed that up quite nicely with the setting of Dark Sun, which was essentially a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting. But the apocalypse had happened because magic had ravaged the world. And in the setting as you start, there are two kind of magicians. There are preservers, those who will take a long time to cast their spells and that will not ravage the wilderness. And there are defilers, those who will basically suck the energy out of nature and use it to power their spells. And that is what continues to destroy the world of Dark Sun. So I think that as D&D became more mature and went out into different ideas, you definitely saw that moving away from that flashbang style of magic, and they explored some other avenues. And I think it's sad now that D&D is it's narrowed itself again down into a real bottleneck, where the average D&D game is much more like the original average D&D games than it was, say, in the second edition golden era, where you had such amazing and iconic campaign settings as Dragonlance and Birthright and Dark Sun and things like that. And it's missing a lot of that now, and I think that's part of what doesn't appeal to D&D 5th to a lot of kind of older gamers, maybe, and gamers who remember a lot of those settings. Don't get me wrong, you can use the brand new rules and you can just plug it into your old campaign settings if that's what you want to do. But I feel like Wizards of the Coast are missing a real trick by exploring some of those worlds that look at magic a very different way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think they've leaned too heavily into Forgotten Realms for one thing, but another, I don't know how much you know about license holding and the rights they have to these stuff, but they have an arsenal of awesome settings like Dark Sun, like Planescape, which has its own magic system, and like Greyhawk and Dragonlance and stuff, and you can have all these different ways that magic works, and it's all sitting there waiting to be used, and they don't touch any of it.
Yeah,
It's very
it's all
frustrating.
theirs, and I realise that they can't do everything at once. Don't get me wrong, I'm not unrealistic, um, but I remember being very excited. You know, I was running my own store when fifth edition came out. I was a very very big fan of fifth edition when it was released. I ran it in the store. I was part of Wizards of the Coast's you know, kind of official D&D in-store gaming program. We used to get the adventures, and you know, I played it for a long time, and it was great. So I'm not supporting any of that. But what happened very quickly was that the source books that were being released, you're right, they either focused very heavily on the Forgotten Realms, or they were a bit lackluster and a bit just unnecessary, really. And I was waiting for these fantastic new versions of the games that I loved. And I know they've touched on some things. You know, they've done Eberron, which I'm not a big fan of. I think it's, you know,
Yeah, give or take.
yeah, it's not for me. I realise why a lot of people like it. You know, that kind of steampunky kind of thing is still very popular. It's very anime, and I get that. I get its appeal. But I think when you're right, they've got this absolute filing cabinet of gems which they haven't really dug down into. I think it's a real shame. But yeah, to drag it back to Magic, I just wanted to defend TSR, you know, who obviously owned D&D at the time, that, you know, they did experiment with different magic systems and some of their, or different approaches to the magic system in some of their campaign settings. So I didn't want to just say that, you know, D&D's approach to magic was very two-dimensional and kind of boring, because I think that would be untrue, I think.
Not that we can spend all day shitting on D&D, but even within a game of 5e, you have different approaches to magic from different classes, you know, and as cliched as it might be at this point, I'm still a fan of the fact that wizards are book learners and sorcerers are this kind of innate instinctual casters, and warlocks have to get their power from someone else. I like the differentiation between the three, and I like the realms that it gives them all to work inside of that are separate to the other ones, but at the same time those Venn diagram circles do cross over a little bit. I enjoy that. You could have a party of spellcasters and still have enough variety to have each one be an individual character. So that, to praise D&D, I think at least they're holding true to that kind of element, which doesn't detract completely from the interest of spellcasting, but at the same time they've got, it's like 10% of what they could be doing. They're really pulling their punches, I think, with 5th edition.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they're still releasing books at a fairly reasonable rate, but I must admit that a lot of the books they're releasing don't appeal to me. As someone who's kind of been there and seen that and done it, and I don't know if I am the target demographic. Maybe I'm not. You know, so that's hard to argue. And I realise that, you know, a lot of people are excited about it. It's doing very well. So I guess we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with that. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so outside of the realm of Dungeons and Dragons, possibly outside the realm of fantasy, what sort of role-playing games are available to me if I want to play a modern day or contemporary setting where I can harness those kind of magical abilities to improve what would be considered a mundane lifestyle?
Okay, I mean, so some of the ones that, well, the main one that leaps to my mind at the moment is written by C.J. Carella, and it's the Witchcraft role-playing game. And it was published under Eden Studios, using the same system as they used for their Buffy and Angel role-playing games and things like that.
Mate, that's awesome, because I'm asking this question because what I really want to get to is, can I play a charmed role-playing game? That's really what I'm going
Now, funnily enough, I don't think there's a charmed role-playing game. Yeah, maybe I'm wrong.
Oof.
Now, there is a supernatural role-playing game based on the TV show, which for some reason, and don't ask me why, has such a high secondary market value. I mean, I've shifted copies of that for, 3 digits, and it blows my mind. I don't know why it's so popular, but it is. So yeah, I don't think there's a charmed one, but if you go to that kind of what's that movie with the girl, teenage high school spellcasters?
Oh, another one you're talking about. It's called The Craft.
The Craft, right? Okay, so to me, Witchcraft, the role-playing game, can be used to kind of present that kind of modern day people getting mixed up in whatever. But actually, it's a very good dark role-playing game, and it takes its presentation of magical and religious systems quite well and quite seriously. Nothing I would expect any less from such a great writer and designer as C.J. Corella. So I think Witchcraft would be one of the big tips to go to. I think also you could use the World of Darkness book, which I think is always a great default for modern settings, and you can do with what you like with that. You can take it all the way from X-Files. And you've got to remember X-Files, even though it became much more synonymous with the UFO idea once it went into its major meta plot. You've got to remember some of those early X-Files episodes dealt with magic, curses and voodoo and astral travel, and there's definitely a supernatural magical element to that kind of X-Files feel. So I think you can do Conspiracy X, you can do World of Darkness, you can do Witchcraft. Esoterrorists by Robin D. Laws is a great dark modern setting where the puppeteers behind the curtain are essentially kind of demon dark worshipping giant owl summoning freaks. So I mean, there's a lot of that, and I mean, you can get into some of the darkest monster manuals written, but one of the darkest ones, I mean, to me, is the book of Unremitting Horror, which was published for Esoterrorists for the Gumshoe system, and it was also released in a D&D 3.5 version. And I mean, that is a real freaky monster book. There's some awful stuff in that. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of modern day role-playing games where you can kind of play somebody who has that kind of magical side to them.
That's great. I love that. I've got a copy of Esoterrorists here on my bookshelf, and next to it is a well-read copy of Night's Black Agents, which is a really great book. I love flicking through and getting ideas from. I could read that book all day long. I love that.
Yeah, for anybody listening, that's the kind of Trail of Cthulhu rules, the kind of gumshoe investigator system that Robin D. Laws came up with. But Night's Black Agents transforms that into a modern day vampire/vampire hunting game, which I think is great. And to me, it smacks of Ultraviolet, the TV show, not the movies, which I just think is so good. Yeah, and do you know what? Right, you played Night's Black Agents. There's a great little movie called Vampire Nation that you could just use as a plot straight into Night's Black Agents.
Really,
watch
Vampire Nation, really.
Yeah, watch Vampire Nation and read Night's Black Agents, and then just go vampire hunting in modern day Romania. Boom, done.
I love it. All right, that's several hours of play right there. For
right there.
Lazy GMs who want to just take a game. Yeah.
I when we mentioned, actually, there's a little story that I want to kind of crowbar in here. And it's got nothing to do with vampires, so it's not a great segue. But
sorry, I've got a story I want to tell you later as well. So you can
have you? All right, okay. We'll swap. Yeah, I'll do first then. And it was to do. It came into my mind when we were talking about the Satanic Panic in the late 70s and the early 80s, and we kind of drifted on before I got a chance to kind of slide it into that conversation. But there was an RPG creator by the name of Professor M.A.R. Barker. Now he was an RPG creator, but he wasn't that foremost. He was a scholar of ancient languages and ancient history, and he was a professor. But he, in order to scratch his itch for the creation of cultures and languages, he created the fantastical world of Tecumel, which some gamers might have heard of, which has had various incarnations. And it's quite early, actually. So the very first incarnation of the world of Tecumel, or the Empire of the Petal Throne, was written as a kind of support to D&D, and I believe it was actually published by TSR, the first version. So he was actually designing the world of Tecumel before the hobby of role-playing games came along. And then when role-playing games came along, he was able to go, well, this is the great vehicle for me to take other players in and let them explore my world and my cultures and my background. And Tecumel is it's a classic example of science fiction that's gone so far that it begins to feel like fantasy again. So for people who are familiar with things like Gene Wolfe and Jack Vance, then it's that great idea.
Numenera.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Numenera is nothing if not the kind of the perfect kind of grandchild of something like Gene Wolfe's Shadow of the Torturer. But we get to Tecumseh, which was, I mean, I liken it to Lord of the Rings in the sense that Barker created this entire language system with Soliani and like Tolkien did with creating the Elven languages, and he was a real philologist and the scholar of culture. And what you get with Tecumseh, and this is where the story's going. This is a preamble just to set the scene. Professor M.A.R. Barker was publishing his books to support his game, and there is essentially a set of good gods and evil gods in the kind of the milieu of Tecumseh, and the dark gods are obviously worshipped by various cultists and priests, etc. And he produced a book called the Book of Ebon Bindings, which was basically like a tome of dark knowledge, which was designed to be exactly what somebody on Tecumseh would be able to read and learn about the dark gods, and a tome of dark wisdom. So he published this, and he was the role playing was in its infancy, and he didn't have a huge profit margin to push into this. And I'm paraphrasing this entire story, but the nuggets of it are true. He published a small run of the Book of Ebon Bindings, and a radical church group got hold of this had been published, and one of them must have flicked through it or whatever, and thought that it looked entirely demonic, very satanic, and no good for anybody's souls. So they rushed round the local area and further afield in order to snap up every copy of this book so they could burn it. So they bought them all, burnt them.
The only thing books are good for.
Yeah. So Professor M.A.R. Barker sat down and penned a letter to this group, this Christian group, thanking them for making the first edition of his Book of Ebon Bindings a sellout, and used the profits from those sales to publish a second, larger edition of the Book of Ebon Bindings. And I think they stopped trying to buy them and burn them at that point because they realised they were onto something, onto a loss. But I think that's just a great classic, kind of true urban legend of how mad this thing got in the late 70s in America, where church members are going around buying this book and burning it, and then M.A.R. Barker's going, well, thanks for that. I can now print some more. I can now print some more. So needless to say that those kind of the early versions of the Book of Ebon Bindings are very rare. And even the second edition, the large black version, changes hands for quite a lot in the secondary market value. So if you're ever, here's a human energy field hot tip. If you're ever in a secondhand bookstore or a craft and a gaming fair or whatever, and you see a weird black book with gold writing on it that says Book of Ebon Bindings, and you don't know what game it's for because it doesn't say on the front, it doesn't say on the back, pick it up and enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, sell it on eBay and make yourself easily over £100.
That's a great hot tip. Thank you.
Great hot tip. There you go.
More hot tips coming at you live.
Yeah, at least one a week. There you go.
We're gonna have a tip segment now, as well as everything else.
I'll just slide them in there. So anyway, that was my little thing I wanted to bring up. What was yours? What were you gonna hit me with?
That was great. My story is going to be more relevant for the film section, so I'm going to tell you mine when we move on to the film section.
Oh, right, okay. I mean, do you want to? Do we feel should we move to the film section? Are we there yet?
I think we've made that decision almost automatically at this point now.
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
So I mean, that was enlightening. Some stuff I'm aware of. Some stuff it's a pleasure to listen to this kind of history about role playing games. And you always kind of run the risk of, I don't know about you, I don't claim to be any kind of expert on Hermeticism or any of that. It's just something that I kind of have a passing interest in, these kind of various areas that are appealing to me from a heavy metal standpoint and a role-playing standpoint and a writer's standpoint, but it's not something that I would ever say I adhere to in any kind of strict sense, but it is fascinating nonetheless to hear about, especially from a gamer's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of shadow what you're saying. I'm no great expert. Obviously, I'd like to consider myself fairly well read with regards to occultism and esoterica, etc. And I'm sure that no matter what deep niche individual people are into, you can quite often make a little bit of a faux pas. But I think if you just want to be a scholar of the magical arts in general, then you can obviously only speak about them in passing, and there are going to be experts who can pick and choose little elements. But I think what we've said is basically sums up a nice relationship between what I would call real magic with a K and fantasy magic, which appears in role playing games. Again, I think it's something we can go back to further when we talk about things. But I think if people are interested in that, there's been enough little references to books that they can go out and seek one of those titles down and get more into that if they want to. So yeah, I think there's enough there for people to take away for now.
I enjoyed that segment, certainly. So let's move on now from the role-playing segment into the film section.
Excited for this.
Good. I was excited for you to see this film. I have chosen for this episode the 2018 horror film Hereditary. If you have not seen this film, I suggest you pause or skip the rest of this podcast and go and watch this film, because there's no way we're going to be able to talk about it without getting into major spoilers. And I think, to be honest, mate, this is going to be a stance we're going to have to take moving forward, because every time we talk about a film, we're going to have to spoil it, aren't we? Let's be honest.
I think absolutely. I think in order to discuss a film, correctly, you're right. There's going to be huge spoilers in it. So if you are interested in seeing it and then listening to our views on it afterwards, pause it, go away, watch it. 2 hours of your time or whatever. That's great, and then come back and then you can join in the conversation.
Yeah, and I would recommend doing so. This is one of my favourite films. There's only been 2 horror films I've ever seen which have made the hairs on my arms stand up. One of them was The Exorcist, and the other one is this film, Hereditary. It's genuinely skin-crawling to me. It's a great piece of filmmaking, regardless of the horror elements or not. I think it's just a success in terms of from a technical standpoint. So you hadn't even heard of this film before I recommended it to you for this episode, had you? Have you heard of the director, Ari Aster? Is it something that you're familiar with?
I haven't seen this film before. Before you told me about it, and I watched it in preparation for this recording. And I wasn't aware of the director's name, although when I did look into who it was, I'm familiar with their work. So seeing that before I watched it made me think, I might be in for something solid and good. I realised Gabriel Byrne was in it. I've got a lot of time for him. I think he's a great actor. And the female lead as well, solid. So, yeah, do you want to kick us off with giving us a brief overview of what the film is about?
Yeah, Toni Collette, awesome actress.
Toni Collette. Yeah.
Hereditary is a contemporary film set in the modern day about a grieving family. The film's mainly about family and suffering. It's been described as a film about a possession told from the perspective of the sacrificial lamb. I think at its core, the director would describe it as a family drama. It's certainly a horror film. It certainly has a lot of horror elements. It takes place in a house in Utah. It's centered around this one family and their kind of history of mental health issues and various other problems that they've had going back through their family tree, which, as the film progresses, we sort of learn more about why and where those issues have come from. There is the husband and wife, played excellently by Gabriel Byrne and Toni Collette. Toni Collette's performance in this is like award winning. I don't know what sort of accolades she received for it, but I could watch her act this frantically grieving mother all day long. She's just like really on point.
I think to jump in there, and I'm going to let you continue, but you're absolutely right. I think her ferocity in playing what looked like genuine grief at some of the events that occurred in this movie was mind blowing, and that to me was some of the real highlights of this film. So yeah, I absolutely agree with her performance in this.
Yeah, and I think regardless of else of what you think, the performances by the actors is enough to watch this film. There's also a very lengthy soundtrack. I think there's like 80 minutes of music or something throughout the film, and that does play a key role in it as well. The story of a long-term possession, we see it unfold, and we see all these kind of recurring themes come into play over and over again, and all these little story elements end up tying together, culminating in the successful summoning of a king of hell, who is brought into existence by this cult who live in this town. And it's something that through the actions and words of the characters of this family, we learn that this possession has been taking place over generations of the same family. It's something that's been tried and tried again. The grandmother, we learn, of the family is friends with the cult who has been attempting these possessions in other members of the family. Failed attempts for various reasons have ended in suicides or what could be considered mental illness problems, but actually are the result of someone trying to bring a demon forth into a human body. So there's a lot of parallels to be drawn with real life struggles and mental health struggles and grief and suffering, but it's sort of draped over this framework of this family drama.
Do you know what, you make an interesting point that I'm going to jump in there and talk about the film, because I actually think if the entire film had been played out in a way that would have made me doubtful whether these events were supernatural or whether they were purely based around somebody's kind of issues and kind of psychoses, I think I would have been left with a much more dramatic, much better taste in my mouth after the movie. I think I would have got much more from it if it had gone down that road a bit more carefully. That I would sit here as the audience wondering, scratching my head, going, "Ooh, is that the influence of the supernatural, or is that in their minds, or is that luck or coincidence?" And I think part of my major issue with this film, and I must say that I liked it on the whole, but my major issue with it that stopped me from really enjoying it was the supernatural elements, which had been presented so excellently and low-key all the way through the film until near the end, had reached a crescendo where it became more like Paranormal Activity than it did like something else. And I think once you reach this element where you have headless bodies floating around, my suspension of disbelief was dropped. Now, I can continue to believe in nightmares and terrible accidents and even a piece of chalk moving on a chalkboard or a glass moving in a seance. I can believe in all of these kind of things because they are rooted in the real world. But once you get past that into this realm of pure fiction, women crawling on the roof and things like that, that to me was where, if the film had kept its nerve, I think it would have been a more successful film in the long run. But I think it decided to, it went too far in the end, is my opinion.
I think this is where our tastes differ, because if I had watched that film and it had only indicated kind of vaguely that there might be something weird going on, but it's up to me to decide if it was in someone's head or if it happened in real life, I would have left feeling very frustrated. So I'm glad that our tastes differ in this case, because I'm happy that it picks a theme and it doubles down on it, and it doesn't hold back and it goes, no, it is about a demon summoning. We're going to have all these metaphorical. You could have had
the last scene where the young boy in the family is crowned the king of hell, one of the kings of hell, Paimon the demon, who is summoned into his mortal incarnation by this cult. You could have had that without all of these super crazy elements of crime on the roof and bodies floating around. You could have had accidents happen, people hurting each other and whatever, and you could have been left at the end wondering whether actually is this group for real, or have things just gone the way that they wanted them to, and they're all wrapped up in this kind of cult psychosis. I think that would have been much more powerful. I think when you end a movie and you don't know whether that was real or not, has much more kind of resonance than buying out of the film because you know what's happened isn't real.
I think that's just a different film.
But I don't think it is a different film, because I think 3/4 of this film, in fact 8/10 of this film, are presented in a way where all of these events could arguably be kind of discussed away by a skeptic. But once you reach the last few scenes, if a skeptic had been witness to those, there is no excuse. And I would have liked to have seen it play out where somebody who came along after could have gone, I can explain this away, even though you as the audience are kind of going, no man, it's real, this possession is real. It's more scary that nobody can really prove it. And I think that's where it loses a bit of credibility towards the end. And I think that the performance of the main two actors, as you quite rightly said, is brilliant up until near the end. And actually, for the last 20 minutes, half an hour of the film, they don't do any acting, because one of them is dead and the other one doesn't say anything. It's just running around essentially like a monster. So they're acting. They cease to act. There's a scene where the man and wife, played by Gabriel, Byrne and Toni Collette, are kind of trying their best to end this ritual that is trying to kind of consume their son. And it's a great scene. They stand in the living room, which has been the scene of so much throughout the movie. It's quite dramatic, and she cries on him. She tells him he's the love of her life, and you can see he's still the skeptic. He's not really buying into the occult activities that have happened. And then when he dies, she goes off to be a monster. That is the last scene they essentially act in. And if the movie had ended then, it would have been a better film.
Well, no, I disagree with that. The film switches between members of the family as it goes along, doesn't it? And you might start the story with the girl, and then you get quite a bunch of scenes with Annie, the mother, and then towards the end of the film, it focuses more towards the son. So we get like a rotation around the family as the film progresses.
I think the reason that's done is to slowly bring us around to the idea that the story's all actually about the boy. It's to deceive us, to keep us guessing, and keep us on the edge of our seat while we decide exactly who the target or the purpose of all these events are. And I think at the beginning the boy is displayed as the outsider, as the kind of somebody who's not massively entwined into these events, but is kind of caught up in them. And eventually we see that actually it's all about him. And I think that's a clever device that they use in order to get us to that point. So I have no issue with that as a story point of view. I think that works particularly well.
I think if this film had no outwardly supernatural elements to it, I would have considered that it was phoning it in, and that it couldn't decide on what it was going to be. And I'm happy that it made its choice, and that there are towards the end, the last 2/10 of the film, as you said, actually go on that kind of balls to the wall. The demon is now in reality and is moving through these different bodies and is crawling up the walls and floating across the ceiling and stuff. It lends it a certain horror that we've been waiting for the whole film, because it's not about jump scares, it's not about creepy eyes and teeth like a cheap cinema film. We've got emotionally invested in these three-dimensional characters that we've seen grow and change and grieve throughout the film and go through these horrible traumas. And then at the end, it makes sense to me that a demon would be able to get inside Annie's body, because I've watched her mind break down over the course of this film. So
I absolutely have no problem with that.
You know what I mean?
I believe that too, and I think this is so nice because it chimes into a conversation we've had about the difference between magic in real life and magic in role-playing games. Here we're talking about the occult and possession and the belief in possession, and in real life, and occult possession and the belief in possession in this movie or movies in general. And whatever your stance is on possession, whether you're a Roman Catholic or whether you are a pagan or a Christian or whatever, there's a lot of people who believe that possession is possible. Now, if you are going to believe possession is a real life possibility, you are not going to accept the possibility that somebody who's possessed can then fly, because that's never been documented, that's never been done. Now, that does not make possession less scary. Now, I've read a lot of things, watched a lot of things that would frighten me about possession, but what's most frightening about them is I'm left wondering, is that really one thing, or is this really another? And I keep coming back to this point that the film makes a decision in order to go what you call kind of balls to the wall. I get that, bravery in one sense, but to me it bursts its own bubble, in my opinion, because then I am less nervous and kind of worried about what you want from a horror movie is you want to be scared. You want to be thinking, oh, this could, what if this was really happening to me or whatever. But once I see a headless body floating around a garden, I'm in Ghostbusters territory at that point. I'm in kind of, I'm in Harry Potter, and all of that real fear is gone by that point. So to me, that's where I can totally see what you're saying. But for me, I just think it's such a good film up until a point, and then it kind of loses its way.
Have you seen The Witch?
I have.
Without spoiling that film, I guess. Do you remember the end scene of that film? Like the very last sort of minute of that film?
I do.
I get the same vibe with that end scene as with this one. You sort of get a confirmation at the end. You're like, oh my god, that's actually real.
I'm gonna give myself a pass out on this one, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I think because of when the film is set and the events around the film, I think what we're doing is watching a representation of historical beliefs, and I think the events that happen in that film were considered absolutely possible by people in that instance, in that time. So to me, it doesn't break tone, and also it's much nearer the end, and it's kind of it's different. I get where you're coming from. I see the simile, but with this, it doesn't do that. I can't buy into what happened at the end of this film, even though I must admit I had massively enjoyed the film as a whole. Although I must admit, I think it runs a little long. I think it over 2 hours, 2 hours 7 minutes. I think it drags in places I don't think it needs to. And I realise you've got to set the tone and you've got to set the pace for a real horror movie, and things have to develop. But I just think it's a little dragging in more than one place.
They actually had hours more of footage of the family talking with each other and establishing more about the kind of relationship between the family members and stuff like that. I will also point out there's the film as a technical achievement is very impressive. All the effects are real, so the chalk moving itself on the whiteboard, on the blackboard, that was done practically. The candle that lights itself, that's practical effects. There's even when she's crawling around the ceiling and stuff like that, that's all practical too. There was hardly any CG in the film, so that's another part of the film that I like.
You can definitely see that, and I definitely appreciate that. That's what lends it that air of realism, which I think was so impressed me for the vast majority of the film, and that's why I think personally I was more upset that it went into this kind of what I call high fantasy element at the end, when a lot of it had been kind of super dark and super realistic to that point. So, but yeah, I can definitely appreciate the way it was shot. The acting was without criticism. I can't fault anybody who acted in it at all. I thought it was really good from that point of view. And what I also liked about it is there were small elements of it that I've only watched it once, and I haven't read any discussion of it on the internet, and I haven't gone in and read any kind of great essay on the meaning of it and little hints and things like that. But what I liked about it on the first watching, and there was tiny little things that I understood, but I didn't quite get. So there's the word that's scratched on the wall in the young child's bedroom, and I get that it's all a possession thing. But what did that word mean? It was why is everybody naked? At the end, like there's a few little things I'm thinking kind of like I'd like to know a little bit more about this, and that's good because it makes me invested to kind of realize that I haven't been offered all of the information on a platter, and that makes it more realistic, which is again a positive to the film. But I wish there'd been a little bit more of that. I wish it had been less pandering to the audience and had the bravery in order to finish the film the way it had started. And I think I would have left the viewing feeling really unsettled. It was actually by the end I was waiting for it to be over, and that's not what you want.
It definitely rewards a second viewing. Or one of my favourite scenes is when the teenage boy is in the classroom and he looks into the reflection and the demon's staring back at him in the mirror, and then it takes control of his body briefly and you watch him be possessed, and then you watch him come out of the possession and react to the fact that he was just possessed, and he's just like completely horrified and terrified about what's just happened to him. That's one of my favourite scenes in the film. It's so good.
I couldn't agree more. I think seeing these possession scenes and people snap out of them was really quite terrifying. And the fact that the scene that you're discussing plays right into what I'm talking about. The boy, smashes his head off the desk, puts his arm in the air, and ends up kind of falling off his chair and then snapping out of it and being very distressed. Now, watching that as a skeptic or a scientist or whatever, you could go, well, that's I don't know the technical term for it, but he's got some sort of diagnosis that has made him do that, and you can really hurt yourself when you're in that state. Of course you can, but we as the audience are watching it knowing that this thing has been released or that this thing is floating around. So we have a real occult kind of sense to it. We know what's really happening. Whereas every kid in the classroom is going to go home and say that this boy just had a breakdown. And that grey matter between reality and fantasy, you can be explained as both, I think is where the film massively succeeds. That is because there's so much of the horror that I can buy into is either just coincidence or bad luck or people just having an absolute breakdown. That's what I think is more frightening than stuff that happens right at the end.
Okay, that is a great point for me to tell you the story that I've been saving for this moment.
Yeah, all right, let's do it.
Going right off the back of exactly what you've just said. So I watched this film. I've seen it a couple times. It does reward a second viewing. The most recent time I watched it with a friend, and after the film we had the sort of standard discussion about Ouija boards. Oh, would you ever use a Ouija board? What do you think about them? And I have heard from separate trusted friends and sources stories about Ouija boards that I take seriously, that are honestly pretty creepy. My friend who I watched this film with, she told me a story. I've texted her and asked her if I'm allowed to speak about this publicly, and she said it's okay. She, in college, she had a tutor, and he, in his younger days, sat around a Ouija board with his friends and began to use it, proceeded to try and activate it, try and use this Ouija board. You have to forgive me, I'm vague on the details, but basically the Ouija board began to move of its own accord, and they were quite rightly shocked into giving up the experience, turning on the lights, putting the board away. And then quite soon after that he fell very ill, and then but the next day he had to go to hospital, and both his legs rotted off his body and his pinky finger rotted off his hand, and he now has prosthetic legs and has to walk with a walking stick. because of this Ouija board experience that he'd had, that it turned his legs leprous and they rotted away from him. Now, I'm not using any names or anything, obviously out of respect, because I have a morbid curiosity about this, but that's quite a heavy story. But I asked my friend if I could relay this, and she said yes. And then I asked her if I could get in touch with the gentleman this has happened to, and she'd given me his name and his details, because he was a tutor and he's a public speaker. So I don't know if you'd be interested. I'm attempting to email him and see if he wants to come on the show and talk about the fact that he used a Ouija board and lost his legs.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm going to put it out there and say, I take that very seriously. I take the Ouija board very seriously. I think it's always blown my mind that something which is almost a perfectly designed ad hoc ritual can be thrown into the hands of the unsuspecting. I've heard many stories, and I've had personal experiences around a Ouija board. So I mean that is quite. You're right. That's quite deep. That's quite dark. If this had that effect on him, I'd be interested to know what the conversation was around the board, and maybe who they managed to speak to, and maybe why it had. If this had a connection to the loss of his legs, then maybe how that had worked. I could understand if it maybe the finger that was on the glass or the planchette, then maybe if that had been the digit or whatever that had suffered, then I think that would be even more weird. But it's the first time I've heard of somebody having their kind of legs affected by the use of a Ouija board. But whatever ailment can come out of it, if this was brought, theoretically brought on by the use of this Ouija board. What you've got to remember is, you're creating an opening at that point. You're creating a real opportunity there for, I'm just going to use the word things, for want of a better word, things to move in different directions. And these things can quite often be the cause of that kind of damage and that kind of pain and harm. So I mean, people who are not prepared to protect themselves and close the same doorways that they open, can often be can be the subject of this kind of foul luck or pain, etc. So yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting to maybe speak to him and see how open he is about whether he really believes that event was what caused whatever it was medically that happened to his legs. Because I'm sure the doctors would have another kind of reason for it. I'm sure they have kind of written that off as something else, and they're not going to say reason for loss of legs Ouija board. That they're not going to say that. I'm not laughing at the guy. The guy's lost his legs. That's terrible. But I'd be interested to see whether he thinks that is a direct correlation and why he thinks that.
She told me that he, as a result of that, he went on to find Christianity, or as a direct result of that experience, right. And he's now a sort of born again Christian. So I mean, that had an effect on him.
That doesn't surprise me spiritually, because I think anybody who goes through something really terrible, whether it's because of something like that or just a random event, I think can often be pushed to question the existence beyond the mortal and the meaning of it all and things like that. So I think anyone pushed to such a life-changing event as the loss of their legs or that kind of thing can often be pushed into a religion, no matter what religion it is. So I don't find that surprising. I think that's just part of the human condition to find kind of need to kind of explain away this or actually just for some sort of level of protection. I can understand that as well. Do you know what I mean? But if I was to speak to somebody like that, the questions would be, whether he really believed that and how that affected everything, and what questions were asked, and that kind of thing, because that would be the real detail, the devil in the details for me. No pun intended.
No pun intended. Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, it would be with all the respect in the world, as well as morbid curiosity. But anyway, so I'm going to try and follow up on that, and I'll let you know if I get anywhere because
Yeah, please do.
I know
Please do.
he's a public figure and he speaks and he does poetry readings and this kind of thing. I know that he's quite open about this, and it was fascinating enough for me to bring it here anyway.
Absolutely. You know, and that's the kind of thing that you can. And I totally see why you brought it up after my comments on the movie, because it really can't be argued either way whether his plight was because of that event, or whether it was just a really poor coincidence. And that's the kind of thing that means you can argue about it, till the sun comes up and not get an answer. Be interesting if you email him and he gets back to you. Definitely keep us updated.
Oh, well, all right. Well, that's another human energy field update that's going to be waiting in the wings to come back in a future episode. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
Well, all in all, I would recommend watching Hereditary again. If you've only seen it the first time and you're listening to this, go and give it a second viewing. There's lots to pick up the second time round. But otherwise, I think we're pretty much done with that film segment, aren't we? What do you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we agree on it mostly. I think we have different views on the end, but it's all good.
Boston film, mate. Do you have a music pick for us to finish off the episode with this time?
I do. It's only vaguely related to the subject at hand, but what I'm going to bring to the table is the 1978 recording of The American Prayer by the Doors.
Okay.
So for those people familiar with the band The Doors, which I'm sure you will be, Jim Morrison, Robbie Krieger, Ray Manzarek, John Densmore, the famous kind of psychedelic rock group. Obviously Jim Morrison was the kind of lead singer, and some would argue the kind of focus of the band. I personally believe that the Doors wouldn't be as good without Jim Morrison, but Jim Morrison wouldn't be as good without the Doors. So I think it's a symbiotic relationship rather than Jim Morrison leading the four. So what we have with The American Prayer is it's essentially a prose album. Jim Morrison was a poet as well as obviously a songwriter. Two things tend to go hand in hand. But what I think is perfect about a lot of Jim Morrison's lyrics and his songs is they work very well as poetry. And he had a lot of poetry and spoken words that he would do live, and he recorded An American Prayer on his own in the studio. No doors, no music, and it was his voice, and it was posthumously that the music was added to it, by the other members of the band and various other technicians in order to release the album that we know as The American Prayer. So I think, to me, it sums up not just the height of what the Doors were, but it's the perfect record to get the idea of this shamanistic, esoteric angle that was so wrapped up with Jim Morrison and his, the legend of the Lizard King and the whole idea of Laurel Canyon in the 60s, and this interest in the occult and the movement of the Golden Dawn over into the kind of west coast of America, and people really being interested in this kind of element of black magic and shamanism and all of these things which are so important to the scene but massively important to the Doors and Jim Morrison. And I think that really comes through in An American Prayer. It's kind of like a long musical ritual, and if you listen to this, if you give it the kind of credence it deserves, and you kind of lower the lights and put some candles on and kind of turn off all the other distractions and listen to this album, you are taken on a journey, and it's a journey. It's a magical journey. It's real outer limits kind of stuff. Are you aware of the album? Do you know of it?
Me and you have listened to this. I'm getting flashbacks to a time several years ago when we were listening to it. Do you know The Warm Progress Under the Stars?
Yeah. Well, this is it. It's just so. It's very quotable. Quiet. I'm not going to get into it because I could just do it. I'm going to stop myself before I begin because otherwise I'm just going to begin to recite it. But I think that's what's so good about it, because it's a piece of work, it's a piece of ritual, I think, and the way that it's been delivered and then crafted afterwards. I think it's a classic example of this magical thread that runs through a lot of these groups, like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and all of this. The other people who would embrace these ideas, and even the Beatles as well, to a degree, for those people who really want to look into that, and how the Beatles viewed Crowley and whatever. And actually, as a little interesting human energy field nugget of wisdom, the fact that we are so familiar with yoga, the fact that yoga is such a kind of all-encompassing, very common part of our Western daily life, is purely down to the Beatles and Aleister Crowley, because George Harrison was a big fan of Crowley's writing, etc., and Crowley was a big proponent of yoga, and the Beatles followed that kind of that journey into India and became big fans of yoga. And because the Beatles were so large, so huge, they carried that love of yoga to America, and then eventually that love of yoga filtered back through to Britain. So the fact that yoga is so huge is purely down to Thelema and Crowley through the Beatles, which is, the whole ties into this whole American Prayer, Jim Morrison thing, because I think there isn't an album which exemplifies that magical belief system, that kind of real otherworldliness about real rock and kind of music, psychedelic and metal music, than the American Prayer.
Wow. Well, next time I do my salute to the sun tomorrow morning, I'll be thinking about that. Talk to me a bit about the Doors' greater body of work and some of the other stuff they've done. And do you think the American Prayer stands out? Is it more separate to their other albums and their other releases, or is it indicative of their kind of general themes and tones that they portray as a band?
You strike an excellent point, because actually American Prayer is so different to anything else that the Doors released, because it's not a Doors studio album. It's not songs that they would have gone on stage and done. It was something that came together and was greater than the sum of its parts. It was Jim Morrison talking, in a studio on his own, and the music was put on afterwards. So what we get with all of the other kind of regular, what I would call them, albums, Morrison Hotel and the Doors and Soft Parade, and you go through them all, but it's very different, so it's very unique in their body of work. It has more in common with live albums than it does with studio albums, in a sense, because there's this. Jim Morrison was very famous for being able to just kind of as the band would play this kind of repetitive rhythm in the middle of a song and a breakdown, he would then begin to talk either with the audience or go off on some poetry or do whatever he was. I mean, that was part of his appeal, that was part of his showmanship, the Lizard King, and I think the American Prayer's got more of that kind of preachy, sermonistic idea about it than a lot of the other main studio albums. So I think, even though the music, some of it will be familiar, and the riffs that are brought in from other songs into the American Prayer, of course, it's all the Doors. The instrumentalists that you hear are, the other members of the Doors. It stands alone in that body of work, and I think to say that there is still a great connection between the American Prayer and the Doors' greater body of work, because the subjects that they were talking about, especially on the lyrics that Jim Morrison wrote, had this kind of real, almost, I'm going to say magical, this magical perception about the way Jim Morrison viewed the world, and the way, therefore, that the Doors, bursting through the doors of perception and all this kind of stuff, which obviously wasn't his, but that was the whole idea of this. I think when you read some of the biographies which I have about Jim Morrison, they only very lightly touch on his connection into, kind of occult practices and everything. What you've got to remember is he was so big and kind of so popular that every 2-bit occult group in America would have wanted him to be a member at some point, you know what I mean? So he would have, in the 60s, you would have got in these parties, you would have got, Satanists and, people in the AA and all sorts of stuff, kind of milling around trying to recruit you into their kind of little cults. And I'm sure the cults were much more kind of prolific and much more varied at that time. So I'm sure that he kind of spent a lot of time with those kind of people. But I think it's credit to him that they wanted him and he never really needed them, which I think was great about Jim Morrison. You know, he was his own master, his own disciple, so to speak. And he was more of a figurehead. He's the kind of guy who could have started a religion. He's got more in common with, Charles Manson than he does with, Anton LaVey. So, and I think this really sums it. This really gives you an idea of where Morrison's head's at in terms of storytelling and myth and magic and stuff like that. So I think anyone who's even vaguely into the occult or esotericism or that kind of element should really go and listen to that album, because it gives you a great insight into the thought processes of the main man behind the doors.
Well, it's a great choice for this episode, man. I really appreciate it. Do you think we will cheapen the American prayer if we play a section of it at the end of the episode?
No. I think if we bow out with Bird of Prey, I think it's a perfect kind of repetitive, almost prayer-like element of the album, which would be perfect for an outro. So we'll end with Bird of Prey, I think.
Lovely choice. We did have a guest scheduled for our what is hopefully a guest segment. He unfortunately couldn't make it this time, but I hope to have him back at some point. Thank you for listening. I've certainly learned a lot this episode. Very insightful, and as winter sets in and as the fog and the ice kind of creeps around this time of year, it's nice to settle into the dark room somewhere and get a little bit creepy with some occult practices.
Yeah, I think we always intend to get people calling in once we're recording episodes regularly and at a certain time zone, we're going to get people to call in. And I think hearing maybe some people's real life experiences with the occult and things like Ouija boards and stuff, I think we can probably do a whole call in section with Ouija board experiences. I think would be great. So I look forward to doing that.
Thank you for listening if you've got this far. If you have any kind of stories of interactions with ghosts or aliens or the supernatural or Ouija boards, or you've been possessed by King Paimon himself or anything of that sort, please do get in touch with us. We're going to have a call-in chaos corner where we open up our third eye and let you guys come in and we all expand our minds together and trade ideas. So do keep an ear out for that. We're going to be announcing how to get in touch with us, how to join in these recordings live while we're doing them, and join the conversation. It's been an absolutely enlightening episode, my friend. Thank you very much for leading the way with this one, educating me and educating our listeners.
Always a pleasure.
Lovely. If you are struggling with your physical health, if you're struggling with your mental health, if you're struggling with your emotional health, get in touch. We want to hear from you. We are going to be putting these out regularly, and I want to have a kind of mental health, well-being message to these things as well. We've all got problems, guys. It doesn't matter what they are. Everyone's struggling with something. You don't have to struggle alone. Join the Instagram, join the Discord, listen to our episodes and get in touch and be part of the conversation with us, and hopefully we can all heal together as a unit and move forward from this terrible year into 2021 and onward even further, and hopefully all help each other to flourish and grow as we do so.
Amen.
Good night, Jamie.
Good night.